We're moving in a new direction, Art. Your services are no longer required. The words just hung there in the air, cold and sterile like everything else in that 40th floor conference room. They didn't echo. The sound-dampening panels on the walls and the thick plush carpet made sure of that. The words were just absorbed into the silence, swallowed by the sheer emptiness of the space my son, Leo, had built. I looked down at my own hands, resting on the polished obsidian surface of the conference table. Knuckles swollen from a lifetime of work, calluses thick as leather, a faint tracing of wood stain under one nail that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. These were the hands that had built this company. Not the gleaming, minimalist version it was today, but the heart of it, the soul. And now, they were being told they were useless. I looked across the table at Leo. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on his tablet, his thumb flicking through charts and projections, his face illuminated by the cold blue light. He wore a suit that cost more than my first car, his hair perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. He looked like the cover of a magazine, a testament to modern success. But in that moment, he was a stranger to me. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager I'd shown how to use a dovetail jig, the young man whose desperate, tear-filled eyes had pleaded with me for a chance. He was gone. In his place sat this cold executive, a CEO who had just fired his own father and was already moving on to the next item on his agenda. My mind started to drift, pulling away from the sheer icy shock of the moment. The clean, filtered air of the office faded away, and for a second, I could almost smell it, the rich, warm scent of sawdust and varnish. The memory came on so strong it was dizzying. 15 years ago. The sun was streaming through the grimy windows of my old workshop in Hickory, catching the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden spirits. It was a mess, my workshop, but it was an organized chaos. Every tool had its place, every stack of lumber told a story. It was more than a building. It was my inheritance, built by my father on land his father had bought. It was our family's history, written in oak, cherry, and maple. Leo, barely 23 at the time, stood in the middle of it all, his eyes burning with an intensity that was almost frightening. He wasn't wearing a suit then, just a worn-out t-shirt and jeans, but he held a sheaf of papers in his hand like it was the Holy Grail, his business plan. He spoke for an hour straight, talking about websites and logistics, and a direct-to-consumer model that would disrupt the entire legacy furniture industry. I didn't understand half of it. I understood the grain of a piece of wood, the feel of a perfect joint, the satisfaction of delivering a piece to a family that would cherish it for generations. He was talking about a different world. "Dad, I just need the capital," he'd said, his voice cracking with emotion. $100,000. It's the only thing standing between this and a multi-million-dollar reality. I looked at my wife, Sarah, who was standing by the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression a careful mixture of a mother's pride and a pragmatist's worry. We didn't have that kind of money. Not liquid, anyway. All our value, all our history, was in the workshop, in the land it sat on. So I made a choice. The hardest choice of my life. I sold 2 acres of the back lot, the part with the old-growth oak trees my own grandfather had refused to cut. It felt like cutting off a limb. I remember the day I signed the papers, the real estate agent in his slick suit smiling while I felt a piece of my soul being carved out. The next day, I met Leo at the bank. I slid a cashier's check for $100,000 across the table. His hands trembled as he picked it up. Tears streamed down his face, and he threw his arms around me, sobbing into my shoulder right there in the bank lobby. "I won't let you down, Dad," he promised, his voice thick with gratitude. "I swear it. We're going to build an empire, you and me." "Art?" The voice snapped me back to the present. It was one of the board members, a young woman with a sharp haircut, looking at me with an expression of mild pity. Leo still hadn't looked up from his tablet. I slowly pushed my chair back, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. I stood up, my joints aching, feeling every one of my 67 years. I looked at my son one last time, searching for a flicker of the boy from the workshop. There was nothing, just a stranger. "I understand," I said, my voice hoarse. And I turned and walked out of the room, leaving our empire behind. That walk out of the conference room wasn't the first time I'd felt like a ghost in my own company. In the years since Leo had moved our headquarters from a sensible, functional building on the outskirts of town to the top floors of a Charlotte skyscraper, I'd started to feel more like a museum exhibit than a founder. The place didn't feel like a furniture company. There was no smell of wood, no hum of machinery, just the quiet whir of computers and the scent of expensive, watered-down coffee. Everything was open plan, with glass walls, polished concrete floors, and furniture that looked like it belonged in a modern art gallery, ironically, none of which was made by us. Leo said it was about cultivating a brand aesthetic. I said it felt like working inside an ice cube. The employees, most of them half my age and fluent in a language of acronyms and buzzwords I couldn't decipher, were always polite. "Good morning, mister." "Vance," they'd say, their eyes flicking away from me and back to their screens before I could even respond. They called me Mr. Vance, while Leo, the CEO, was just Leo. It was a small thing, a sign of respect, they thought, but it felt like a wall. They saw me as a figurehead, a black and white photo on the Our Story page of the website, the old man from the dusty workshop in the sepia-toned past. They didn't see the man who still spent his weekends experimenting with new wood-bending techniques or the one whose hands could feel a flaw in a plank of maple just by running his palm over it. The tension between my world and Leo's had been building for months, like a hairline crack in a piece of solid oak, slowly growing under pressure. The breaking point, I think, began a few weeks before that final meeting. I was walking through the design department, a cavernous white room where young designers stared intently at glowing monitors. On one of the screens was a 3D model of a new dining chair. It was sleek, minimalist, and completely soulless. But that wasn't what bothered me. I leaned in closer and read the material specifications. MDF core with premium ash veneer. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. MDF, medium density fiberboard. It's essentially sawdust and glue, pressed into a board. We had built our name, the Vance name, on solid wood construction, on pieces that were meant to be passed down through generations. This was disposable. It was a cheap imitation of craftsmanship designed to look good on a website for a few years before the veneer started to peel at the corners. I found Leo in his corner office, a glass box with a panoramic view of the city. He was on the phone, pacing and gesturing, closing some big deal. I waited patiently, my hands clasped behind my back, feeling every bit the relic everyone saw me as. When he finally hung up, he flashed a brilliant, predatory smile. "Big news, Dad. We just locked in a partnership with a major hotel chain. 1,000 rooms. Are we furnishing them with those new chairs, Leo?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "The sawdust and glue ones?" His smile faltered, replaced by a familiar look of impatience. "Art, we've talked about this. It's about scalability. We can't produce 1,000 solid ash chairs in a fiscal quarter without tripling our overhead. This is how we grow. The margins are incredible." "Our margin used to be our reputation," I said quietly. It was the fact that a man could buy a Vance table and know his grandson would one day sit at it. What's the reputation on this? That it'll last until your credit card is paid off? He sighed, running a hand through his perfect hair. It was the sigh of a man burdened by the naivety of his elders. Nobody cares about that anymore. They care about the brand, the lifestyle. They want the look, and they want it now. "You're thinking like a craftsman, Dad. I'm thinking like a CEO. We sell a story, an aesthetic. The physical product is just a delivery system for the brand experience." A delivery system, that's what 40 years of my life's work had become. A delivery system for a brand experience. I looked out the window, at the sprawling city below. It all looked so impressive from up here, so powerful. But it felt as hollow as one of those cheap chairs. I had helped my son build a kingdom, but I was starting to realize it was all just a veneer, and I was the old, solid wood core he was desperate to replace with something cheaper. The argument over the MDF chairs was a symptom of the disease, but I wouldn't discover the sickness at the heart of it all until the week of the quarterly investor call. I was in the small windowless office they'd assigned me a space they called a focus room, going over the quarterly supply chain reports. It was something I still insisted on doing. Leo saw it as a pointless ritual, a sentimental old man wanting to feel included. But for me, the numbers told the story of the wood, and the story I was reading just didn't make any sense. According to the report, we had purchased a massive volume of certified, sustainably forested North American white oak, enough to build thousands of our signature dining sets. My heart swelled with a bit of pride. Maybe my talk with Leo had gotten through to him after all. But then I looked at the cost column. The price we'd supposedly paid per board foot was a fraction of the market rate. I knew the suppliers. I'd worked with some of their families for decades. They were honest people, but they weren't running a charity. There was no way we were getting premium oak for these prices. It was impossible. A cold feeling crept up my spine. For the next 2 days, I dug. I stayed late, long after the young employees had flocked to their trendy downtown bars. Using my old login credentials, the ones they'd never bothered to revoke, I started cross-referencing the supply chain reports with our shipping and import manifests. It was like piecing together a puzzle in the dark, but slowly, a horrifying picture began to emerge. We were buying the expensive, certified oak, but only in small, token amounts, just enough to get the paperwork and the eco-friendly certifications we plastered all over our website. The real volume, the lifeblood of our production, was coming from a different set of suppliers. Unnamed shell corporations shipping container after container of cheap, uncertified lumber from parts of Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, notorious for illegal logging. The numbers were being systematically cooked. The cheap wood was being logged under the budget lines of the expensive wood, creating a massive slush fund of untraceable profit. This wasn't just about using cheaper materials anymore. This was a deliberate, calculated fraud, designed to deceive our customers, our investors, and the regulatory bodies. This was a criminal enterprise hiding inside my family's company. I printed out the conflicting manifests, my hands shaking slightly. I found Leo in the big conference room doing a final run-through of his investor presentation with the CFO and a couple of marketing heads. I didn't wait for him to finish. I walked right in and slapped the papers down on the obsidian table. The sharp sound made everyone jump. "What is this, Leo?" I asked, my voice low and tight. He glanced at the papers, and for a split second I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes before it was replaced by a mask of pure annoyance. "Art, we're in the middle of something. Can this wait?" "No, it can't wait," I said, pushing one of the manifests toward him. "This says we're shipping in pine from a blacklisted supplier in Romania. And this report, the one you're about to present to our investors, says this is all certified white oak from Pennsylvania. Make it make sense for me, son." The CFO shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The marketing people suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. Leo just stared at me, his jaw tight. He let out a long, slow breath and gave me a look of profound, weary disappointment. It was the look of a genius trying to explain quantum physics to a child. "It's called strategic sourcing," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "It's a diversified materials portfolio designed to maximize cost efficiency while maintaining our brand's market position." "Brand position?" I almost laughed. "You mean the lie we're selling them? Leo, this is fraud. It's illegal. What you're doing could land you in prison." And that's when the disdain, the pure, unadulterated contempt he'd been hiding for years, finally came pouring out. He stood up, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but it cut through the room like a razor. "My God, you still don't get it, do you? You still think we're in the business of selling tables and chairs?" He leaned across the table, his face inches from mine. "We are not. We are in the business of selling a stock price. We sell a growth narrative. The chairs, the wood, the goddamn family legacy you talk about, it's all just props, Dad. Props we use to tell that story." He straightened up, smoothing his tie. "And you," he said, his voice regaining its boardroom composure, "your outdated, sentimental, and frankly legally inconvenient view of the world is a risk to that story. It's a risk I am no longer willing to tolerate." He turned his back to me and nodded to the CFO. "Let's take it from the top of Q3 projections." I just stood there, speechless. The son I had raised, the boy I had given everything to, had just told me that his entire life was a lie, and that I was an inconvenience for noticing. I looked at the papers on the table, the evidence of his crimes, and then at the back of his head as he stared at the projection screen, and I knew it was over. The company was a lie, and the son I knew was gone forever. I was frozen. My feet felt like they were encased in cement, trapping me in that room where the air had become thin and sharp. The papers I'd brought in, the proof of my son's crimes, lay on the polished table like a failed peace treaty. The CFO, a man named Richards who I'd known for 5 years, wouldn't meet my gaze. He busied himself by straightening an already perfect stack of documents. The two young marketing executives looked like they were trying to merge with their chairs, wishing themselves invisible. They were all accomplices, silent witnesses to the patricide that was about to take place. Leo, however, was a study in absolute calm. He had already dismissed me from his mind. I was a problem that had been dealt with, a piece of old furniture to be moved out of the way. He sat down, adjusted the tiny microphone clipped to his lapel, and took a sip of water. A red light blinked on the conference phone in the center of the table. They were live. "Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Vance Modern Q3 investor update call." Leo's voice was transformed. The cold, cutting whisper he had used on me was gone, replaced by a warm, charismatic baritone that radiated confidence and control. It was a voice you could trust, a voice that could sell sawdust as solid oak without a hint of deception. I stood there by the table, a ghost at the feast, and listened to him paint a masterpiece of lies. He spoke of robust growth, of exceeding projections, of innovative supply chain management. My stomach turned at that one, and of a future so bright it was blinding. I should have left. I should have turned and walked out, preserving what little dignity I had left. But I couldn't. I was held there by a morbid, horrified fascination. I needed to see the final swing of the axe. I was the condemned man, and for some reason I felt compelled to watch my own execution. After about 10 minutes of weaving his beautiful, fraudulent narrative, he paused. It was a perfectly timed, dramatic pause, designed to make everyone on the other end of the line lean in closer. "Now," he said, his tone shifting to one of solemn importance, "as we look toward the future, it is essential that our leadership structure reflects our dynamic, forward-thinking vision. It's about agility, streamlining our decision-making processes, and empowering the next generation of leadership." My blood ran cold. I knew what was coming. Every word was a polished stone, carefully chosen to build a wall between the company's gleaming future and its inconvenient past. And as part of our forward-looking strategy to streamline governance, he continued, the words flowing as smoothly as varnish, "We are announcing a strategic restructuring of the advisory board. Effective immediately, Arthur Vance will be stepping down from his role with the company." Stepping down. The words were so soft, so gentle, so utterly gutless. Like a doctor telling you they were letting your father go when what they meant was that they were pulling the plug. In the room, no one moved. No one breathed. I felt the heat rise in my face, a burning shame that spread from my neck to my ears. My life's work, my name, my legacy, all of it, erased in a single sanitized sentence. Leo wasn't finished. The final twist of the knife was yet to come. "We thank him for his foundational contributions," he said, the phrase dripping with condescending finality, "and we wish him the absolute best in his well-deserved retirement." Retirement. He had sentenced me to irrelevance. He had taken my identity and replaced it with a rocking chair on a porch, a slow fade into senility. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it was almost sublime. It was a perfect crime, committed in plain sight, with no weapon other than words. For a moment there was a stunned silence on the line. I could almost hear the investors and board members processing the information, the quiet shock of a public hanging. I imagined them in their own offices, exchanging confused glances. His own father? But Leo, the master showman, didn't give them a second to dwell on it. He didn't allow for a moment of awkwardness. He just kept going. "Now," he said, his voice instantly regaining its upbeat, energetic tempo, "if everyone could please turn their attention to slide 7, let's dive into our exciting Q4 projections." And that was it. The moment passed. The gears of the great machine he had built began to grind forward again, and I was left behind, a piece of human gristle caught in the works. My legs finally unlocked. With a stillness I didn't know I possessed, I turned away from the table. I didn't look at my son. I didn't look at his silent co-conspirators. I fixed my eyes on the heavy oak door at the far end of the room. Every step felt like wading through deep water. The air was thick with my humiliation. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I knew Leo's weren't among them. His were fixed on the future, on slide 7. As my hand touched the cool metal of the door handle, the last thing I heard was the muffled sound of his voice, confidently spinning another lie about another projection. Then the door clicked shut behind me, and the only sound left was the frantic, broken rhythm of my own heart. The heavy door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was more violent than any shout. The muffled drone of my son's voice was gone, and I was alone in the 40th floor hallway. For a moment I just stood there, my hand still on the cool metal of the door handle. I could feel the faint vibrations of the building around me, the hum of 1,000 invisible systems all working in perfect harmony to keep this glass kingdom running. A kingdom that had just declared me a traitor and cast me out. I took a slow, shuddering breath and leaned my shoulder against the wall, the smooth, cold glass, a poor substitute for something solid. The words echoed in my head, not Leo's words, but the ones he'd put in my mouth. Stepping down, retirement. It was a quiet, tidy assassination of my character, my purpose. He hadn't just fired me, he'd erased me, rewritten my story's ending with a footnote. My feet began to move, seemingly of their own accord, carrying me toward the elevator bank. My reflection slid along the polished walls beside me, a stooped, gray-haired man in a suit that suddenly felt 2 sizes too big. I didn't recognize him. Arthur Vance built things. Arthur Vance had sawdust under his nails and a purpose in his hands. This man was a ghost. The elevator arrived with a soft, deferential chime. As the doors slid open, I stepped into the mirrored steel box and pressed the button for the lobby. The descent was unnervingly smooth and silent. 40 floors. It had taken me a lifetime to climb this high, and it was taking less than a minute to fall all the way back down. My own reflection stared back at me, a stranger with my face, and for the first time that day I saw the full depth of the wound in his eyes. The lobby was a cathedral of commerce, bustling with the energy of young, ambitious people. They flowed around me like a river around a stone, their faces bright with purpose, their minds already on the next meeting, the next deal, the next rung on the ladder. I was invisible to them, a relic from a bygone era. I walked to the marble security desk, where a friendly guard named Marcus, a man I'd shared stories with about our grandkids, was on duty. He gave me a warm smile. "Afternoon, Mr. Vance. Heading out early?" I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. I just nodded, reaching into my pocket. My fingers closed around the familiar weight of the company car keys. It was a modest sedan, nothing fancy, but it was a part of the life I had, the identity that was now gone. I placed the keys on the cool marble counter between us. The small metal clink sounded like a gavel falling. "Marcus," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Could you make sure Leo gets these? I won't be needing them anymore." The smile on his face faltered, replaced by a look of confused concern. "Sir, is everything all right?" "I'm retiring," I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I didn't give him time to ask more questions. I just gave him a final nod and turned away. Instead of heading towards the parking garage, I pushed through the giant revolving glass doors and stepped out onto the street. The city air, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and hot pavement, hit me like a physical blow. The roar of traffic, the shriek of a distant siren, the chorus of 1,000 conversations, it was a chaotic symphony, and I was suddenly a man with no part to play. My car was in the garage. My home was a 30-minute drive away. But I couldn't bear the thought of getting behind the wheel. I couldn't bear the thought of being enclosed, of being still. I needed to feel the ground under my feet. So I started walking. I didn't have a destination. I just walked, letting the relentless rhythm of the city swallow me whole. I walked past gleaming storefronts, past busy outdoor cafes, past parks where children laughed and played. With every block, the numbness began to wear off, and a deep, profound grief began to seep into the cracks of my shattered composure. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was the hollow, aching sorrow of a father who had not only lost his life's work, but had lost it to the very son for whom he had built it. I was adrift in the city my son now owned, a stranger in my own life, walking toward a horizon that had suddenly gone completely dark. It took me 2 days to work up the courage to go back. 2 days of sitting in my armchair at home, with my wife Sarah, moving around me with a quiet, heartbreaking gentleness, as if I were a piece of fragile glass that might shatter at the slightest touch. She didn't push. She just made me coffee, sat with me in silence, and waited. Finally, on Saturday morning, when the sun was just beginning to climb into the sky, I knew I had to do it. I couldn't let my life's work be swept into a dumpster by some anonymous cleaning crew. My security card, surprisingly, still worked. I guess Leo, in his grand strategic vision, had overlooked the small detail of deactivating his own father's access. Or maybe he just didn't care. The office was an echoing tomb, completely silent, except for the low hum of the climate control. Sunlight streamed through the floor to ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the empty air. It felt sacrilegious to be there, like walking through a graveyard after hours. My office, the focus room, was just as I'd left it, with one addition. Someone from HR had placed a neat stack of flattened cardboard boxes just inside the door, the corporate equivalent of a body bag. Methodically, I began the grim task of packing. Each item I touched was a ghost, a memory from a life that was no longer mine. I picked up a framed photo of a much younger Leo, maybe 25, shaking the hand of the governor as he accepted a Young Entrepreneur of the Year award. I was in the background, just over his shoulder, my face split by a grin so wide with pride it almost hurt to look at. I wrapped it in bubble wrap and placed it gently in a box. Next were the books, old volumes on joinery and wood finishing, their pages soft and worn. Then came a collection of old, hand-drawn blueprints, rolled up and tied with string, the original designs for the solid, honest furniture that had first made the Vance name mean something. It all went into the boxes. Then my hand hesitated over the last item on my desk, a small, simple carving of a songbird, its head cocked as if listening. I'd whittled it from a single block of cherry wood for Leo's 5th birthday. I remembered his small hand closing around it, the look of pure wonder in his eyes. He'd kept it on his desk for years, until the day he'd given it back to me, saying it didn't fit the minimalist aesthetic of his new office. Now, the bird felt impossibly heavy in my palm. It was the last remnant of the boy who had gotten lost somewhere inside the CEO. I wrapped it in a soft cloth and put it in my pocket. It wasn't going in a box. The office was bare now. The boxes were taped shut. An entire lifetime condensed into a few brown cubes. A profound emptiness washed over me. This was it. The end. But then, a thought struck me. My desk. My real desk. The beautiful roll-top desk I had built with my own 2 hands from a single cherry tree that had fallen on my father's land 30 years ago. Leo had banished it when we moved to this glass palace, calling it a clunky antique. He'd promised to put it in storage. A cold dread mixed with a new, unfamiliar anger propelled me through the silent office. I checked the main storage room. Nothing. Another smaller one. Just old computers. Finally, in a dark, cramped supply closet at the end of a forgotten hallway, I found it. It was shoved into a back corner, covered by a dusty plastic tarp and hemmed in by boxes of obsolete marketing flyers. They were treating it like trash. I pulled the tarp off, and my breath caught in my throat. Even covered in a thick layer of dust, it was still beautiful. The deep reddish grain of the cherry wood seemed to glow in the dim light from the hallway. I ran my hand over the smooth, curved top, a surface I knew better than my own reflection. I remembered the long hours, the careful measurements, the scent of the wood shavings. This desk was a part of me. It was solid. It was honest. It was built to last. It was everything that Vance Modern was not. And seeing it discarded here, left to rot in the dark, something inside me shifted. The sorrow that had been weighing me down for days began to burn away, replaced by a cold, hard ember of defiance. My son had taken my company, he had taken my name, and he had tried to take my dignity. He would not have this. This desk was mine. It held my history, my soul. And as I stood there in the darkness of that forgotten closet, my hand resting protectively on its worn surface, I made a silent vow. I wasn't just going to pack up my legacy. I was going to reclaim it, starting with this desk. Standing there in the dim closet, I knew I couldn't leave my desk behind. But a problem of physics immediately presented itself. A 30-year-old masterpiece of solid cherry wood weighs about as much as a small car. Moving it was not a one-man job. I pulled out my phone and made a call I hadn't made in months, to my old friend Charlie, a cabinet maker from down the road who'd retired a few years back. He didn't even hesitate. "Give me an hour," was all he said. An hour later, Charlie was standing beside me, running a reverent hand over the desk's dusty top. "Good Lord, Art," he whistled. "I remember when you were building this beast." Criminal to have it stuffed in here. Getting it out was a clumsy, sweat-soaked ordeal. We grunted and strained, maneuvering the heavy desk through the sleek, soulless hallways of Vance Modern. The sight of two old men in dusty work clothes wrestling a piece of classic furniture through this temple of minimalism must have been quite a picture for the security cameras. As we loaded it onto his pickup truck, Charlie slapped the solid wood and grinned at me. You know, this old thing has more character and integrity than this entire glass tower put together. He had no idea how right he was. We set it up in my garage workshop at home, the one place I still felt sane. It looked magnificent, even among the clutter of my own tools and projects. It was like a king returning from exile. Sarah came out to see it, wiping her hands on her apron. She just looked at the desk, then at me, and a small, understanding smile touched her lips. She knew this wasn't just about a piece of furniture. It was about reclaiming a piece of myself. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning it. It was a meditative process, wiping away years of neglect, polishing the brass handles, feeling the familiar contours under my cloth. As I worked, my craftsman's eye caught something, a detail that would have been invisible to anyone else. On the side panel, a small piece of decorative inlay, a tiny carved leaf, was sitting less than a millimeter proud of the surface. It was a flaw, but I didn't make flaws. My heart began to beat a little faster. I remembered a trick an old German master had taught me decades ago, a mechanic's mark. I pressed the leaf. Nothing. I tried to turn it. Still nothing. Then I remembered. It wasn't a press or a turn. It was a sequence. I pushed the leaf in, then slid it down. A soft, satisfying click echoed from deep within the desk's structure. A section of the knee-well paneling, seamlessly integrated into the design, popped open, revealing a hidden compartment no bigger than a shoebox. I had built this feature into the desk as a young man, a playful secret to hide away. What? Old letters? A bottle of good whiskey? I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd opened it, but the compartment wasn't empty. Lying on the bare wood was something that didn't belong, an object of modern technology lying in a 19th century hiding place. A single, black, portable hard drive. A wave of confusion washed over me. Then a memory surfaced. For the first 2 years of the online business, before the fancy offices and the soaring profits, Leo had worked from this very desk. He had run the entire fledgling company from my workshop, using my desk as his command center. He must have used this compartment, and then, in his meteoric rise, simply forgotten it existed. With a sense of growing dread, I took the hard drive into my study and plugged it into my old desktop computer. My hands felt clumsy on the keyboard. For a moment, I almost hoped it would be password protected, that I would be spared from knowing. But it wasn't. The drive opened instantly. It was a complete backup of a computer, dated nearly 10 years ago. It was a digital ghost of Vance Modern's infancy. The folder structure was simple, almost amateurish, but the names of the folders made my blood run cold. Investor, Dex, DRaft, Supplier, Contracts, Original, Accounting, Internal. I clicked on Accounting, Internal. Inside were 2 spreadsheets. One was titled Official Q1 Report. The other was titled Real Q1 Report. I opened them side by side. The difference was staggering. A deep, systemic rot, right from the very beginning. The fraud I had uncovered last week wasn't a new development. It was the company's founding principle. I kept digging, my horror growing with every click. I found a folder of emails between a young, hungry Leo and those same shell corporations in Romania. They were explicitly discussing the reclassification of materials to bypass import tariffs and environmental regulations. I found the original investor decks, filled with projections and promises based on these fraudulent cost models. He hadn't just stumbled into corruption, he had designed it. It was his grand vision. The full, crushing weight of it all landed on me. My sacrifice, the sale of my ancestral land, the $100,000 that had felt like an investment in my son's dream. It hadn't been seed money for a legitimate business. It had been the startup capital for a criminal conspiracy. The entire empire, the glass tower, the fancy suits, the glowing magazine articles, it was all built on a foundation of lies that I myself had paid for. The grief I had felt for days was burned away in an instant, replaced by a pure, cold, clarifying rage. The stranger in the boardroom wasn't a recent transformation. He was the real Leo, and the devoted son I remembered had been the illusion. I sat there in the dark, The only light in the room, the pale, incriminating glow of the monitor. On the corner of the desk, where I had placed it earlier, sat the small wooden bird, a relic of a love I thought was real, now a silent witness to a betrayal so profound it had rewritten my entire past. My quiet act of defiance had just unearthed an armory, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was a war I would have to see through to the end. The rest of the night passed in a blur of pale light and damning evidence. I sat there for hours, clicking through file after file, each one a nail in my son's coffin. The cold rage that had initially seized me slowly began to thaw, leaving behind a deep, chilling anguish that settled into my bones. This wasn't just a matter of corporate malfeasance. It was a biography of my son's corrupted soul. I saw the deliberate, methodical choices he had made, year after year, to choose deception over honesty, greed over integrity, and the most painful part was seeing the dates on the earliest files. He had been planning this, living this lie, while I was still teaching him how to properly finish a piece of cherry wood, believing I was passing down a legacy of honest work. The weight of the hard drive on my desk felt immense. It was a Pandora's box, and now that it was open, I was faced with an impossible choice. I closed my eyes and saw two paths stretching out before me, both leading to a different kind of hell. On one path, I could destroy the evidence. I could throw the hard drive into a river, burn the desk, and try to forget what I'd seen. I could save my son from prison, save my wife from the agony of watching her only child be destroyed, save our family name from the public shame, but I would have to live with the knowledge that I was complicit. My silence would be an endorsement, making me a partner in his crimes against all those innocent people, the investors, the customers who had placed their trust in our name. On the other path, I could expose him. I could take this evidence to the authorities and let justice run its course. I would be upholding the principles I had lived by my entire life. I would protect the innocent, but I would be the instrument of my own son's destruction. I would be the one to send him to a cage, to strip him of his future, to tear our family apart so completely that it could never be healed. What kind of father does that? What kind of man chooses abstract principle over his own blood? I didn't know how long I'd been sitting there when a soft light filled the doorway. It was Sarah, wrapped in her old woolen robe, her face etched with worry. "Arthur?" "It's almost 4 in the morning. What are you doing?" She came in and saw the look on my face, the graveyard of documents open on the screen. She pulled up a chair and sat beside me, her presence a small, warm anchor in the churning sea of my despair. I didn't know how to start. How do you tell the love of your life that the beautiful boy you raised together is a monster? I didn't have to. I just turned the monitor towards her and, with a trembling finger, clicked open the file labeled Real Q1 Report. I watched her face as she read. I saw the confusion morph into disbelief, then into a dawning, sickening horror. Her hand came up to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears that she refused to let fall. She didn't say a word. She just sat there for nearly an hour, as I quietly guided her through the labyrinth of deceit I had discovered. I showed her the emails, the fake invoices, the 2 sets of books. I showed her the truth. When I was finished, she finally looked away from the screen and stared into the dark corners of the room, as if seeing the ghosts of our past. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a ragged whisper. All this time, all these years, it was all a lie. She wasn't asking a question. She was stating the devastating conclusion she had reached. The tears finally came, silent tears that traced paths down her weary face. She was grieving not for a company, but for the son she thought she knew, for the beautiful family photos on our mantelpiece that had suddenly become portraits of a stranger. My own voice broke as I asked her the question that had been tearing me apart. "What do I do, Sarah? What in God's name am I supposed to do? He's our son. He's our boy." She reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. She looked at me, her eyes clear and full of a pain that mirrored my own, but also something else, a fierce, unwavering certainty. "I remember when he was 10, she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He stole a candy bar from the corner store. You found the wrapper in his pocket, and you walked him right back there and made him apologize to Mr. Henderson and pay for it out of his own allowance. You told him that day that a man is only as good as his word, and that nothing is worth the price of your own integrity. She squeezed my hand, her gaze unflinching. You taught him to be a good man, Arthur. You did your job. What he chose to become, this person on this screen, that isn't your fault. Her words hung in the air, a painful, terrible, and necessary truth. He made his choices, she whispered, a final tear tracing a path down her cheek. Now you have to make yours. You have to do what's right. In her eyes, I found the answer I had been looking for. It wasn't an easy answer. It was the hardest one imaginable. But it was the only one we could live with. We sat there together, holding hands in the quiet darkness of my study, until the first gray light of dawn began to break through the window. The decision was made. The anguish hadn't disappeared, but it had finally settled into a grim, unshakable resolve. The next morning I drove into town, not into the sprawling, gleaming heart of Charlotte, but to the quiet, tree-lined main street of our own smaller town, where I had lived my entire life. My destination was a familiar two-story brick building with the words Carter and Associates, attorneys at law, etched in gold leaf on the front window. Ben Carter wasn't just my lawyer. He was a man I'd played high school football with. He'd been at my wedding, and I'd built the bookshelves that lined his office. He'd watched Leo grow up. If anyone could understand the impossible situation I was in, it was Ben. His office was a sanctuary of order and tradition. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and lemon polish. The walls were paneled with the dark, rich mahogany I'd installed for him 20 years ago, and every surface was covered with leather-bound legal books. It was a room built on precedent and facts, a world away from the shimmering illusions of my son's glass kingdom. Ben greeted me not with a handshake, but with a concerned look, ushering me towards one of the worn leather armchairs in front of his massive oak desk. "Arthur," he said, his voice low. "Sarah called. She said you needed to see me. Said it was urgent. You look like you haven't slept in a week." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I just pulled the portable hard drive from my coat pocket and placed it on his desk. "I need you to look at this, Ben, and I need you to tell me what happens next." For the next hour, he was no longer my friend. He was my lawyer. He plugged the drive into his computer, and I walked him through the labyrinth of files, my voice a flat monotone as I pointed out the fraudulent invoices, the 2 sets of accounting books, the damning email chains. I watched his face as the full scope of the deception became clear. His expression shifted from professional curiosity to shock, and finally, to a deep, profound sorrow. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly with a handkerchief, and let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at me, his eyes full of a friend's pain. "Oh, Art," he said softly, "I'm so sorry." He swiveled in his chair and stared at his computer screen, now a litany of my son's crimes. "Legally," he began, his voice shifting back to the measured tone of an attorney, "this is airtight. It's a prosecutor's dream. You've got meticulously kept records of wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy, the works. This isn't a civil suit waiting to happen. This is a federal case, plain and simple." He looked me straight in the eye, and the gravity of the situation settled over the room like a shroud. "I need you to understand what that means, Art. Once we hand this over to the U.S. Attorney's Office, it is completely out of your hands. It becomes a runaway train. You can't stop it. You can't have second thoughts. You can't decide to protect your son later." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk. "The process will be brutal. You will become the government's star witness. Leo's defense attorneys will try to tear you to shreds on the stand. They will paint you as a bitter, vengeful old man jealous of your son's success. They will drag your name, Sarah's name, your entire family's history through the mud to create reasonable doubt. It will be the hardest thing you ever do." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And for Leo, this isn't a fine. This isn't a corporate slap on the wrist. If they convict him, and with this evidence they will, he is going to prison for a long time, 10 years, maybe more. He will be stripped of everything he's ever built. His life, as he knows it, will be over." Ben gave me one last, searching look, the final check from a friend. "Are you absolutely sure this is the path you want to take? Because once I pick up this phone, our boys' lives are changed forever." I thought of the sleepless night, of Sarah's tear-streaked face, of her quiet, unwavering resolve. I thought of the innocent investors who trusted our name. The decision was already made, forged in the fires of grief and betrayal. My voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. He built his house on a rotten foundation, Ben, I said. I'm just the man who's pointing out the cracks before it falls down and kills a lot of innocent people. A look of sad understanding passed over my old friend's face. He gave me a single, slow nod. Then he reached for his phone, his movements deliberate and final, and began to dial. Ben's call set the machine in motion with terrifying speed. 3 days later, I found myself with him in the passenger seat of his car, driving to a part of Charlotte I'd never seen before. Our destination wasn't a gleaming courthouse or an imposing FBI headquarters, but a drab, anonymous-looking office building made of brown concrete and tinted glass. It was the kind of place you could drive past 1,000 times and never notice, a monument to bureaucratic indifference. This, Ben explained, was where you went when you had a problem big enough to interest the federal government. We were led to a small, windowless room on the 3rd floor. The only furniture was a metal table, 4 uncomfortable-looking chairs, and a water cooler humming in the corner. The air was stale, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, monotonous drone. It was a room designed for extracting truths, devoid of any comfort or distraction. 2 people were waiting for us. A man in his 50s with tired eyes and a rumpled suit, who introduced himself as Agent Miller from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and a younger, sharper woman with an unreadable expression, Agent Zhao from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They didn't shake our hands, they just nodded, their movements economical in all business. The air was thick with a quiet, professional gravity. This wasn't a friendly chat. It was the beginning of a process, a legal avalanche I was about to trigger. Mr. Vance, Agent Miller began, his voice a gravelly monotone, thank you for coming in. Your attorney has provided us with a summary of your allegations. Before we proceed, I need to be clear. This is a voluntary proffer. We are here to listen to your information. At the end of this meeting, we will decide whether to open a formal investigation. Everything you say from this point forward is on the record. Do you understand? I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. I understand. For the next 2 hours, I performed my terrible duty. Guided by Ben, I laid out the story, not with the emotion of a betrayed father, but with the simple, factual clarity of a craftsman describing his work. I explained how I'd reclaimed my old desk and found the hidden compartment. I handed over a copy of the hard drive, and on Ben's laptop, I walked them through the file structure. I showed them the 2 sets of books, the fraudulent supply chain manifests, the emails where my own son, discussed methods for deceiving customs officials. The agents listened without interruption, their faces betraying nothing. They were professionals, human seismographs trained to detect the slightest tremor of a lie. They let me speak until my story was done, until the entire, ugly truth of my son's empire was laid bare on the metal table between us. Finally, Agent Zhao leaned forward. Her eyes were like chips of obsidian, sharp and penetrating. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice calm and even, your termination from the company occurred just a few weeks ago. Is it fair to say that your decision to bring this information to us is a result of that event? It was the question I knew was coming. The question that would determine whether they saw me as a credible witness or just a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Ben started to speak, but I held up a hand. This was my answer to give. I met her gaze directly. Agent Zhao, being fired by my son is what forced me to pack up my office. It's the only reason I found the desk where this hard drive was hidden. That's the truth, I said, my voice steady. But it's not why I'm here. I'm here because those numbers represent hundreds of investors who believe they're buying into an honest company. I'm here because the name my father gave me is being used to commit felonies. My job is gone. That doesn't matter anymore. The truth matters. The 2 agents exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. It was all the confirmation I needed. They believed me. Agent Miller closed the laptop. Mr. Vance, based on our initial review of this evidence, we will be opening a full joint investigation into Vance Modern, its board of directors and its CEO, Leo Vance. He slid a small stack of papers across the table. This is a formal witness cooperation agreement. It stipulates that from this moment on, you cannot have any contact with your son or any employee of the company. You cannot discuss this investigation with anyone other than your attorney. You are now a cooperating witness in a federal criminal case. I picked up the pen. It felt impossibly heavy. This was it, the point of no return. The ancient Roman general Julius Caesar, leading his army across the Rubicon River, had said, "The die is cast. He was marching on Rome, starting a civil war. As I signed my name, I felt a sliver of what he must have felt. I was declaring war on my own family, on my own son. When we stepped back out into the bright afternoon sun, the world looked exactly the same, but I was a different man. I had just handed the keys of my son's kingdom over to the people who would burn it to the ground. There was no victory in it, no satisfaction. Just the cold, heavy certainty that I had done what had to be done. I had crossed the river, and there was no going back. The weeks that followed my meeting with the federal agents were the quietest, heaviest days of my life. I was a man living in limbo, a ghost in my own home. I had set a colossal machine in motion, and now had no choice but to wait for its gears to grind toward their inevitable conclusion. Every day, I'd see the Vance Modern logo on a passing truck, or a billboard, and my stomach would clench with a mixture of old pride and new sickness. Sarah and I moved through our days in a state of suspended grief, the unspoken topic of our son hanging in the air between us like a constant, low hum. Every time the phone rang, we would both jump. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. It was Agent Zhao. Her voice was as professional and devoid of emotion as it had been in that sterile room. Mr. Vance, I'm calling as a courtesy to inform you that the federal warrants have been signed by a judge. We will be executing them tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. at the Vance Modern headquarters. We strongly advise that you stay away from the area. I thanked her and hung up. I stood by the window looking out at the familiar trees in my backyard. Tomorrow, after all the waiting, it was finally here. Sarah came and stood beside me, sensing the change in the air. It's tomorrow, isn't it? She asked softly. I just nodded. You shouldn't go, Arthur, she pleaded, her voice thick with concern. There's no need for you to see it. I have to, Sarah, I told her, my voice quiet but firm. I started this. I have to bear witness to the end of it. She didn't argue. She understood. This wasn't about gloating. It was about accountability, and that accountability included my own role as the reluctant witness. The next morning, I was sitting in a small, greasy spoon diner across the street from the Vance Modern Tower long before the sun came up. I nursed a single cup of black coffee, watching the city slowly come to life. The sky bled from black to gray to a pale, indifferent blue. At 7:30, the morning rush began. Young professionals in sharp suits hurried past, clutching briefcases and coffee cups, their faces set with the ambition of a new day. They streamed into the glass and steel lobby of the tower, completely oblivious. At 7:58 it began. It wasn't loud or dramatic, like in the movies. It was quiet, efficient, and utterly chilling. 3 black sedans with government plates pulled up to the curb, not with sirens, but with the silent authority of predators that have cornered their prey. A dozen men and women in dark blue windbreakers emerged. I could see the letters stenciled in yellow on their backs. FBI, Secret. They didn't run. They walked with a calm, deliberate purpose into the lobby. A few of them remained outside, securing the doors. The Glass Kingdom was officially under siege. I held my breath, my coffee forgotten. At exactly 8:15, Leo's silver BMW pulled into the executive parking spot. He stepped out, looking immaculate in a dark charcoal suit, talking animatedly into his phone, probably closing another deal, telling another lie. He strode towards the entrance, the king of his castle, completely unaware that his kingdom was already occupied territory. He pushed through the revolving doors, and for a moment, he was out of my sight. I could only imagine the scene inside, the sudden halt in his confident stride, the confusion on the faces of his employees, the quiet authority of the agents stepping forward to intercept him. A minute later, the revolving doors pushed open again. It was Leo. But he wasn't alone. Agent Zhao was beside him, and another agent was holding his arm. The arrogant confidence was gone from his face, replaced by a mask of indignant disbelief. This is ridiculous, I could read his lips saying. My lawyers will hear about this. They stopped on the plaza just outside the entrance. Agent Zhao said something, her expression unreadable, and then I saw the glint of metal. The audible, sharp click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists seemed to cut through the morning air, even from across the street. The mask of disbelief on Leo's face finally shattered, replaced by a wave of pure, uncomprehending panic. This was real. As they began to lead him towards one of the sedans, his head swiveled, his eyes frantically scanning the street, the gathering crowd of onlookers, as if searching for an explanation, an escape. And then his eyes found me. Through the window of the diner, across 4 lanes of traffic, our gazes locked. Time seemed to slow down. In that single horrifying moment, I saw it all in his eyes. The confusion, the rage, and then a sudden, sickening flash of understanding. He knew. He knew it was me. The son looked at his father, and in his eyes was the face of his destroyer. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply sat there and held his gaze, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. My expression was a mirror of my soul, a landscape of profound sadness, etched with the grim lines of a necessary duty. They pushed him into the back of the car. More agents began to emerge from the building, carrying cardboard boxes overflowing with files and computer hard drives, the guts of his company, the evidence of his crimes, all boxed up and ready for judgment. News vans, tipped off and smelling blood, began to screech to a halt nearby. The media circus was beginning. I had seen enough. I put a $10 bill on the table, stood up, and walked out of the diner. I didn't look back at the flashing lights or the unfolding spectacle. I got in my old truck and drove away. The image of my son's face, the face of a cornered, betrayed animal, burned into my memory. The empire had fallen. Justice was beginning its slow, grinding work. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending. The year that passed between Leo's arrest and the start of the trial was a long, slow grind through a special kind of hell. Our quiet life was over. The Vance Modern scandal was a recurring feature in the financial news and the local papers. Our name, a name I had spent a lifetime building into a symbol of quality and trust, was now synonymous with greed and fraud. Friends we'd had for 40 years would cross the street to avoid us. Sarah stopped going to her book club. We became quiet prisoners in our own home, living with the heavy, unspoken truth of what was to come. The process was a blur of depositions and meetings with prosecutors, each one forcing me to relive the betrayal, to recount the story of my son's crimes until the words felt like smooth, worn stones in my mouth. The federal courthouse was an imposing block of granite and marble, a place designed to make a man feel small. The courtroom itself was dark and cavernous, paneled in a mahogany so dark it seemed to absorb the light. It was a somber, silent place, and for 3 weeks it was our world. I sat with the prosecution. Sarah sat alone in the second row of the gallery, a pillar of quiet maternal grief, and at the defendant's table sat Leo. The sharp, tailored suits were still there, but they hung on a frame that was thinner, tighter. The arrogant gleam in his eye had been replaced by a sullen, simmering resentment. He looked like a caged animal, and whenever his gaze fell on me, it was with pure, unadulterated hatred. When my time came, I walked to the witness stand, took the oath, and swore to tell the truth about my own son. The prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman, led me through my story. I told them about the desk. I explained the 2 sets of books, not as an accountant, but as a woodworker. It's simple, I told the jury. One of these pieces of paper says you're using solid oak. The other one proves you're using cheap pine. One is the truth. The other is a lie told for money. I spoke calmly. I presented the facts. I never once looked at Leo. Then came the cross-examination. Ben had warned me it would be brutal, and he was right. Leo's attorney, a high-priced lawyer from New York, came at me with everything he had. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice dripping with theatrical sympathy, "isn't it true that just days before you discovered this supposed evidence, your son, Leo Vance, the CEO, had terminated your employment?" He told me my services were no longer required, I said. "So you were a disgruntled employee, correct? A bitter old man, angry that the company had outgrown you and you wanted revenge. Isn't that what this is really about?" I looked past him, at the 12 ordinary faces on the jury. "My son's success was the proudest moment of my life," I said, my voice quiet but carrying through the silent courtroom. "His dishonesty was the greatest sorrow. I'm here because of the dishonesty." The jury deliberated for less than a day. I'll never forget the sound of them filing back into the jury box, the finality of their footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Leo stood beside his lawyer, his jaw clenched. He looked at me then, for the first time since the trial began, his eyes wide with a desperate, boyish fear I hadn't seen since he was a child. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a tired face, handed a piece of paper to the clerk. "On the charge of federal securities fraud," she read, her voice clear and steady, "we, the jury, find the defendant, Leo Vance, guilty. A sharp, broken sound escaped from the gallery. It was Sarah, a sob she couldn't hold back. On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Guilty. With each word, Leo seemed to shrink. The fight went out of him, the anger, the resentment, all of it collapsing inward, leaving behind an empty, hollowed-out shell. On the charge of money laundering. Guilty. It was over. Justice, in its cold, impartial way, had been served. But as I looked at my son's broken form and heard my wife's quiet, heartbroken sobs, I felt no triumph. There was no victory, only the devastating, undeniable price of the truth. The verdict was just, but the regret that it had ever come to this was a wound that I knew would never truly heal. I went to Sarah, helped her to her feet, and together we walked out of the courtroom, leaving the wreckage of our family behind us. Another year has passed. The news cycle moved on, as it always does. The Vance Modern scandal is now just a footnote in the business pages, a cautionary tale for aspiring executives. The company was broken up and sold for parts, its assets liquidated to pay back a fraction of what the investors lost. And Leo is in a federal correctional facility in West Virginia. He'll be there for another 8 years. He doesn't accept my calls. Sarah writes to him, but he never writes back. In many ways, the son we knew is gone from this world. The pain of that loss is a quiet, constant companion, a ghost that lives in the corner of my heart. But it is no longer the roaring fire that consumed me. It is the pale, soft scar of a wound that has, against all odds, begun to heal. I spend my days now where I always should have been, in my workshop. The garage is my sanctuary, filled with the comforting scent of cedar and sawdust. The sun streams through the window, illuminating the familiar, orderly chaos of my tools. My old roll-top desk, the silent witness to this whole saga, sits proudly in the corner, its cherry wood glowing with a deep, warm luster. It serves as my workbench, my place of planning, my connection to a past I have finally made peace with. On its corner sits the small wooden bird, a quiet reminder of both what was lost and what endures. I am not idle. Last month, I finished a handcrafted cradle for the new baby of a young couple down the street. Right now, my hands are busy shaping the arm of a rocking chair for an old friend. I am not building an empire anymore. I am just a man, building good, honest things for good, honest people. There is a peace in that, a satisfaction that no stock price or quarterly projection could ever provide. I am not alone here. A teenager from the neighborhood, a quiet boy named Sam, with curious eyes and a steady hand, comes by 3 afternoons a week. He wants to learn. He wants to know the difference between a mortise and a tenon, to feel the way a hand plane can peel off a shaving so thin you can see through it. I am teaching him. I am passing on the things my father taught me. The other day, as we worked, he looked at me and said, "You know, Art, I wish my dad knew how to do stuff like this." In that moment, I understood. I had spent so many years thinking that my legacy was the company, the money, the name on the side of a skyscraper. I thought it was something I was building for my son. I was wrong. A true legacy isn't a thing you leave behind. It's the integrity you live with, the skills you share, the quiet dignity of a life well lived. I lost a son and a fortune I never truly wanted. But in the end, in the quiet of my workshop, surrounded by the scent of honest work, I finally found my soul again, and I am at peace.